When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel, and happy Halloween. This is probably my favorite holiday of the year, and I always like doing like kind of a spooky week for you guys on Halloween week, and both today and Sunday's video will be on House Bolton. Today we're going to cover the Dreadfort, the history of it, kind of similar to the way we talked about the Night Fort, just with the Dreadfort. And the Dreadfort, just on the name, I mean, it's a really eerie place. It is kind of mysterious. We've only been there one single time in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's not a place, I would say, that is covered in history as much as something like the Night Fort or Winterfell or some of the other major castles, but I did want to talk about it as a minor castle because, well, it is playing a significant role in the Winds of Winter, and we've even seen Stannis contemplating trying to attack the Dreadfort, but it doesn't end up going that way because, well, one, it's a trap, and two, Jon Snow talks him out of it. But either way, the Dreadfort is really interesting because from everything that I looked at on research, the Dreadfort has never actually been conquered. Nobody has been able to take it. It's kind of similar to something like Storm's End outside of, well, Storm's End is probably a bigger and better defensible castle. But in terms of the North, I mean, Winterfell has been taken more times than the Dreadfort has. I mean, easily. The Boltons throughout their history have, at a number of times, burned Winterfell, which is kind of ironic given the fact that in A Song of Ice and Fire, they added to that tally, burning Winterfell through Ramsay. But today's video, we're going to go through the Dreadfort, and then Sunday's video, we're going to talk about, is Roose Bolton a vampire? A little bit about the history of House Bolton, and a little bit of the susness of the character of Roose Bolton. So, starting out with House Bolton, they are a house that is about as old as House Stark. They come from the First Men and go all the way back even to the Long Night. So they're a very ancient house. And one thing that you kind of have to understand with House Bolton is, especially at the beginning when you're thinking about everything they're doing, they're making their banners a flayed man. They're naming their castle the Dreadfort. They very much rule with fear. They're very different than, say, House Stark in that manner. And you think about all the stories we're being told about how they would dress up in the skins of their slain enemies, and that's even maybe how they were able to conquer Winterfell multiple times. They have a very dark, cruel, mysterious past that we just don't really know a lot about. All we do know is that at the height of their power, House Bolton, for the most part, seemed to control most of the eastern coast of the North. At one point, their kingdom stretched from the last river in the White Knife to the Sheepshed Hills. Now, just so I can show you guys kind of on a map, that really means like their lands expanded all the way down to almost where the Hornwood land is. It also makes sense as to why later we see Ramsay wanting to get that back, because that's some of the land that they seem to have lost over the years of rebelling against the Starks. And also you think about where their castle is situated, the Dreadfort, it's right on a river. And it's also kind of where you have a narrow stretch of where there's only a little bit of land if you actually wanted to go south, say, White Harbor or to the Hornwood lands. There's only a little bit of a strip of land that comes right past the Dreadfort. So the Dreadfort is positioned well because, well, you're already on a river that will extend then to the ocean. It'll be good for shipping and things like that. It's really well situated in terms of that. A lot of things you see in ancient history is you always needed to position your castle near some type of body of water for trade and even fishing, food, things like that. So on the basis of that, the Dreadfort is positioned quite well. But then also it kind of stands as like an outpost in a lot of ways because you can control any of the land trade, or if any armies are trying to come to the south more or less, or at least on the eastern side of the North, you would kind of pass right past the Dreadfort. That is why in a lot of ways I think House Bolton was so powerful. They're really the only house that rivals House Stark in terms of power and is ever able to really stand up to them in a meaningful way. A lot of it, I think, comes from just being able to control trade, being able to control a lot of land mass, and that is a really big part of the Dreadfort. And so you see that right away as they were once called the Red Kings, very fitting given their sigil being kind of like this red and pink sigil with the flayed man, very much meant to strike fear in their enemies. Very different than some other houses like maybe, House Tyrell, like theirs isn't really supposed to strike fear or anything like that. It's kind of interesting the way we look at House Tyrell's sigil because it's almost like not threatening. You shouldn't be threatened by us, and we work kind of in the background and we try to marry and gain power that way. Very different here with the Red Kings of the Boltons, more or less. So I then want to kind of describe the Dreadfort. Now, like I said, we've only been to the Dreadfort one time, and we've only been there very briefly. In A Dance with Dragons, with Theon's first chapter, we do see the Dreadfort all but very briefly. We get a little bit of its descriptions and things like that. The layout of the Dreadfort is a strong fortress with thick stone walls and massive towers. The castle has triangular merlons which look like sharp stone teeth. Even the castle itself looks very intimidating. Again, House Bolton is completely based on fear factor, and that's why they've been able to survive so long, is that you don't want to mess with House Bolton because of what will come from it. The great hall of the Dreadfort is dim and smoky, with rows of torches grasped by skeletal human hands jutting from the walls. Even just simple things like, their torches are extremely, weird. It almost looks like there's human hands that have been made into these torches. Everything is built on fear. So when we look at House Bolton, they're not one of these nuanced houses in terms of they have some good people in their house and they have some bad people in their house. House Bolton is obviously painted by George as the villains of the North. And can you really fault people for not liking House Bolton just based on the way they portray themselves? Think about our first introduction into House Bolton through A Song of Ice and Fire. Our first two ones that stick out to me are when Ned thinks about Robert's Rebellion and how Roose Bolton was kind of a cruel man. He wanted to kill Barristan Selmy just because he stayed true to his vows and fought for the Mad King. And so we see that doesn't end up happening. Robert likes to pardon people, even that he's defeated and that have gone against him. We see he does that quite a lot. It's one of his strengths and flaws. I think being able to make peace with your enemies or people that you fought against is a very valuable skill. But I think at times he also didn't do enough in terms, especially House Lannister. Think about the next time we really hear about House Bolton and we're introduced into them. It's really Robb Stark when Catelyn comes back and reunites with Robb as Robb is starting to move south. He gets to Moat Cailin. Robb kind of describes Roose as being this person that whenever he looks at him, all he can imagine is this secret room within the Dreadfort of them flaying their enemies. And that's what House Bolton has done for thousands of years, is building up that reputation and keeping you off balance and fearing them. And that goes even further because nobody's been able to actually take the Dreadfort and nobody's been able to defeat the Boltons. The Boltons have defeated the Starks multiple times and have rebelled against the Starks multiple points and broken their vows of, say, they swear an allegiance to them or they put away their crown. They have at multiple points been a house that could have been extinguished because of their loyalties, but they've been able to live on because of their strength. Because taking the Dreadfort would just take years of effort of trying to siege them, and even that would be very difficult given the Dreadfort's position. And also trying to take the castle by storm, you would lose probably thousands of men, even if you had more men than the Dreadfort and House Bolton. So you see that right away. House Bolton, they have grown a reputation that even puts someone like Robb, who's willing to stand up to the Great John, for instance, but against Roose, he kind of feels a little off balance. But getting back to the layout of the Dreadfort, but also in its great hall it had long tables that stood behind a dais with a high table in the seat of the Lord of the Dreadfort. The hall has a vaulted ceiling and wooden rafters turned black from smoke. The kennels are located in the Dreadfort's yard, and steep steps lead down to the dungeons. This is the thing that the Dreadfort is known most for its torture rooms, and also this alleged room where the Boltons have the skins of their enemies. And some even believe that they use these skins almost similar to the way the Faceless Men use the faces to transform into other people. And even when we think about the way that House Bolton was able to take out Winterfell and burn it and sack it, the rumor that we have is that the way that they were actually able to do that is House Bolton would wear the skins of a prince of Winterfell or anything like that, and they would sneak into the castle. That is kind of interesting, given that Winterfell is this really strong castle. Now, the really big difference is the Winterfell that we see by the time of the main story is very different than the Winterfell that would have been during these early years in the Bolton and Stark history. And so that's really important to understand, that we don't really know how defensible and strong Winterfell was. But even if it was, it makes sense that there was trickery that was done by the Boltons, because the Boltons, yes, were able to rival the power of House Stark, but I would assume that House Stark was a little bit more powerful than the Boltons. Because you got to remember, a lot of points in which the Boltons rebel against the Starks, it seems like it's literally just their house. It's not even other houses in the north. it is mainly House Bolton. Now we'll talk about another house a little bit later, in House Greystark of the Wolf's Den. But just know, in these early years for the Dreadfort, it was kind of seen in a way of like how we look at Maegor. So Maegor would always have Tiana of the Tower. She would like torture people in the black cells and do all these things, and it gave it a really bad reputation. Like, take that and then just apply it to the north. That's the way House Bolton is looked at. And so the Dreadfort over the years, it was never taken. Nobody was ever able to take the Dreadfort from what we've been told by George. Now, could George, come up with something different in the next book he writes, if we ever get a Fire and Blood Part 2, or we get more of the history of House Bolton? Could this be rewritten? Yes. There's not a lot to go off of with House Bolton. We know in terms of during the Age of Heroes, this is when kind of the Dreadfort was becoming their seat of power. And we know that the Boltons eventually submitted to the kings in the north from House Stark near the start of the coming of the Andals to Westeros. And it's interesting because we don't necessarily know why, House Bolton submitted to the kings of the north and the Starks. I would likely think that it was more of a self-preservation idea with, yes, we don't like the Starks, but we also don't like the Andals coming over and, bringing all their new ideologies and all this other stuff. And that is more on the reason why I think House Bolton went with House Stark, just based upon the fact that, like, this wouldn't stop their rebellions. Like the Red Kings and the Boltons would at multiple times go against House Stark. But something else I think is interesting that I do want to bring up, we talked about the Night's King in the last, really castle video. I think it's interesting because a rumor we have is that that person, the Night's King, could end up actually being a Bolton. And it would make sense given on the fact that House Bolton is our villainous house, more or less. And it would be really interesting if we look at the Night's King, and if he was, using the skins of his enemies. It would make sense if he was a Bolton. It would also go to the idea, like, when we look at Roose Bolton, he has a very interesting look in terms of his eyes and the way he almost seems to have this very soft voice and whispering, and he leeches himself. It's really interesting to think about, if the Night's King did actually like reproduce with this. It seems like his queen was an other or something along that line. And what if that then created the next line for the Boltons? Like their child actually survived and went back to the Dreadfort, maybe being handled by some other person at the Dreadfort. We don't know a lot about who was ruling House Bolton at that point. Like we don't know if like the Night's King, if he was a Bolton, did he have a brother there, or similar to like Benjen and Ned at the beginning of the story. It'd be really interesting. There's a lot to explore with that, and we're definitely going to talk about that a lot more in Sunday's video, but I really did want to bring that up here. But we do know that the Boltons achieved some successes against the Starks, with King Royce II and King Royce IV burning Winterfell. According to rumor, some Boltons wore the flayed skins of Stark princes and lords, such as the son of Bael the Bard, as cloaks during the Age of Heroes. We know that the last king, Rogar the Huntsman, submitted to Winterfell when the coming of the Andals to Westeros was beginning, like I mentioned earlier, and that King Theon Stark, the Hungry Wolf, and the Boltons defeated Argo's Seven Star and his Andals in the Battle of the Weeping Water. And as they would become vassals to Winterfell, that would not end the issues going on between House Bolton and House Stark. The Dreadfort rose in an unsuccessful rebellion with the Grey Starks of the Wolf's Den against the Starks. And it makes sense given their proximity. The Wolf's Den is more or less where White Harbor is at this point, and they are on the eastern side. So the southeastern, I should probably say, more or less rose in defiance of Winterfell. Now, it's interesting, though, is that this rebellion did not go well for the Boltons. They ended up losing this. But for their house, they ended up surviving. Nothing actually occurred to them. I mean, they probably lost lands, of course, and probably lost maybe captives or hostages. But the Grey Starks did not. The Grey Starks were basically completely wiped out. And that's really key here, because it tells you that House Bolton was not easily just deposed, especially because of how powerful they were at this point. You couldn't just like remove them. And that's really important to understand as well. We then skip forward in time a bit, but the Boltons then threatened Winterfell during the reign of King Edric Snowbeard. At some point, unspecified centuries ago, the Boltons rebelled against the Starks as the Stark armies besieged the Dreadfort for 2 years before the Boltons capitulated to King Harlan Stark and dipped their banners once more. But it's very important to understand the Dreadfort surrendered. It wasn't taken. This was a 2-year-long siege that eventually the Boltons realized, okay, we can't defy them anymore. But the Dreadfort was never taken. The Dreadfort held strong. If it stood for 2 years, that means it was a formidable enough castle that even the Starks didn't want to risk all of their men dying trying to take the castle, and they were content to just wait. So I really want to point that out, is that the Dreadfort, in my opinion, is a very slept-on castle, especially in the north. I would say it's up there as probably the best castle in the north. Around 1,000 years ago, the Boltons then bent their knees to Winterfell and agreed to abandon their practice of flaying. It is rumored the skins of their enemies hang in a room within the Dreadfort, however, and I think it's very clear that the flayings did not stop. But what did occur is that House Bolton started to have to do it a bit more secretly. They couldn't openly do it as much, or they had risked the wrath of House Stark, and by this point, the Boltons had been beaten down enough times to where they couldn't really openly rival House Stark. House Stark had the love of most of the northern houses that would spring up during this point, or even the older ones, and House Bolton just couldn't stand alone against them. It's kind of similar to like House Frey with like the Riverlands, and so you see why that alliance works so well, because you have the Boltons, who are really ancestral enemies to the Starks. You have the Freys that are looked really not fondly upon by Westeros in general because of them being a much newer house and the way that they earned their power and wealth. But both houses, they are like your second tier. If there's Winterfell and there's Riverrun, well, your next tiers are, well, the Twins and the Dreadfort. That's the way I think those work so well. And you even think about something like the First Blackfire Rebellion. The one thing that you see with the First Blackfire Rebellion is that a lot of Daemon Blackfire's support comes from like those second tier houses, those houses that were looking to get to becoming the top dog in their region. And so, for instance, you had houses like House Peak, for instance, that was trying to rival houses like House Hightower and House Tyrell. But nothing really would come from the Boltons during the era of Aegon Targaryen. You know, they backed House Stark and bent the knee. And so there's not a lot to talk about. I talked about earlier how Ned Stark fought in Robert's Rebellion and what Roose Bolton suggested in terms of killing Barristan Selmy. And the last real notable thing that happens before A Song of Ice and Fire is that we know Domeric Bolton, Roose's son and heir, was allegedly killed by his half-brother, Ramsay Snow. So that is really the history that we have of kind of both House Bolton, but also the Dreadfort. And so there's not a lot to talk about in terms of the Dreadfort itself when we start diving into some of the theories about House Bolton. But I'll say this about the Dreadfort. The Dreadfort and the Nightfort are very similar in terms of their reputation, outside of just the Nightfort is more magical in terms of it's on the wall and all of the horrible, cruel things that have happened there have given it a very ill reputation. The Dreadfort is more like, it is openly like, this is supposed to make people fear us. It's supposed to put that doubt in people's heads that if you go against us, this is what will happen to you. You will be flayed. One of the worst things that could possibly happen to a person. And especially when you have someone like Roose, who kind of keeps his reign very quiet. He doesn't let things get out to House Stark about what's going on in his lands. And you can see that there's that bitter rivalry between the two. But House Bolton was really looking for that one thing that could put them back on top. And that's what they got during the War of the Five Kings. Now, I don't think that's going to end up well for them, but it's what House Bolton did. So thank you guys all for watching. If you guys have more you want to talk about with the Dreadfort, feel free to put that in the comments. If there's anything I missed that you'd like to talk about, put that in the comments as well. And thank you guys all for joining me. I hope you guys have a great Halloween, have a great weekend, and we'll be back on Sunday to talk Roose Bolton being a vampire. Is it a crazy theory, or is there some evidence to back it? Let me know what you think before we get to that video, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.